Imagine like stepping out of this freezing New England winter. It's 1841, and you're descending into this basement in East Cambridge,
Oh,
Massachusetts.
man.
Yeah, and it's just pitch black. The air is completely stagnant, and it smells incredibly foul.
Right. It's the kind of dark that just feels heavy on your skin. And as your eyes sort of slowly adjust to the gloom, you realize the shadows in the corners are actually moving.
Because you're standing in a prison,
Yeah.
and you see them. There are these four individuals locked in cages, but they aren't criminals.
No, they're not.
They're mentally ill, and they're confined right alongside violently deranged inmates, treated not as patients, but literally labeled by the state as loony paupers.
It's just a scene of absolute, like, dehumanizing misery. We really have to remember that the medical consensus of the time, I mean, it essentially viewed severe mental illness as a loss of fundamental humanity.
Wow.
Yeah, the system just looked the other way. They abandoned these people to these totally unregulated, underfunded nightmares. The goal wasn't treatment at all.
It was just to hide them.
Exactly. Just lock them away so, polite society didn't have to look at them.
So into this highly specific nightmare steps a woman named Dorothea Dix. And this single shocking moment in that East Cambridge basement, it's about to ignite a 10,000-mile crusade that basically changes global medicine.
It really is.
Welcome to this deep dive. Today, our mission is to unpack the life of Dorothea Dix, this legendary social reformer who, essentially built the first generation of American mental health infrastructure from the ground up.
From absolute scratch, yeah.
Right, and we're going to look at the source material today to explore a story of just world-shifting persistence, but also one of deep and really fascinating contradictions.
Because, when you look at the stamps and the statues honoring her today, it's easy to see her as this flawless, saintly pioneer.
Oh, for sure.
But her legacy is actually much more complex and honestly way more human than the polished history suggests. To really understand the massive institution she built, we first kind of have to understand the chaos she was running away from.
Yeah, let's definitely start there because, how does someone end up in a freezing prison basement, discover this horrific injustice, and just decide to take on the entire world to fix it?
Yeah.
She certainly wasn't born a powerful political lobbyist.
Oh, far from it. Not at all. She was born in Maine in 1802, and her early life was profoundly unstable. Her mother suffered from chronic illness, which left her unable to really provide any consistent support.
Right.
And her father, he was an itinerant bookseller and a Methodist preacher, but the sources point out he was also an abusive alcoholic.
So just a completely chaotic environment for a kid. There's like no safety net, no predictability at all. Every day must have just felt like navigating a minefield.
Exactly. And so at the age of 12, she makes this desperate, really drastic move. She takes her two younger brothers and she just flees to Boston.
Wow. At 12?
At 12, she goes to live with their wealthy grandmother, Dorothea Lind. She is actively escaping her parents.
But she doesn't just, settle into a quiet life of luxury with her rich grandmother, right? The sources show that by the time she's 14, she is already teaching.
Yes.
And she isn't just assisting in a classroom. She's actually developing her own comprehensive curriculum for a girls' school in Worcester. And it focuses heavily on, like, ethical living and the natural sciences.
Which is just a staggering amount of responsibility for a 14-year-old to take on. But it sets this lifelong pattern for her. By 1821, she opens a formal school for well-to-do families in Boston.
Okay.
And then shortly after that, she starts a second school, teaching poor and neglected children straight out of her grandmother's barn. I mean, she's constantly working, constantly creating this rigid structure.
And it takes a severe toll on her because the sources note she suffered from incredibly poor health and what historians now pretty much agree were major depressive episodes.
Yeah, her body just couldn't keep up.
Right, so during her 20s, like 1824 to 1830, her health actually forces her to pivot from teaching to writing. So she writes these devotional books and stories for children. Her book, Conversations on Common Things, it was a massive hit. It reached its 60th edition.
That's huge for the time.
Huge. And she also wrote The Garland of Flora, which was literally one of America's first 2 dictionaries of flowers.
Which, a dictionary of flowers sounds like this quaint, polite Victorian hobby.
Yeah, very proper.
Right. But if we connect this to the bigger picture of her psychology, the historical record points to something much more profound.
Actually, I want to propose an analogy for this, if you think about it. You have a child who grew up in an abusive alcoholic home where she had zero control over her safety, right?
Right.
And suddenly she's writing these meticulous teaching curriculums and literal dictionaries of flowers. It feels like someone trying to relentlessly categorize and control their environment as an escape mechanism.
Oh, absolutely. Like, if you can just put the whole world into neat little boxes and define every single petal on every single flower, maybe the world won't feel so terrifying and unpredictable.
The historical evidence supports that psychological reading beautifully. She was trying to build an orderly, perfectly defined world to replace the disordered one she survived.
That makes total sense.
But that relentless, just grinding drive for order, it eventually pushed her physical health completely past the breaking point. By 1836, she suffers a complete physical and mental breakdown. She has to close her model school.
Oh, wow.
But surprisingly, this total collapse is actually the catalyst for a trip that will change the entire trajectory of her life.
Right, because if her superpower was creating order, what happens when her own body refuses to follow the rules? So her doctors encourage her to travel to Europe to rest and recover. And she sails to England in 1836, just searching for a cure.
And she ends up staying at Greenbank, which is this grand ancestral mansion in Liverpool owned by the Rathbone family.
The Rathbones, right? Yeah, they were these really prominent Quaker social reformers. They had this firm belief that the government shouldn't just be a passive observer, it should actually play a direct, active role in social welfare.
Okay, so she's right in the middle of it.
Exactly. By staying under their roof, Dix is thrust into this high-level circle of progressive European thinkers.
And she meets people like Elizabeth Fry and Samuel Tuke, and these are the leaders of the British lunacy reform movement.
The heavy hitters, yeah.
Right. They aren't just complaining about the madhouses. They're actively investigating them, publishing deep, data-driven studies, and they're presenting hard evidence to the House of Commons. So she's basically watching a masterclass in how systematic research can force political change.
And while she's absorbing all these revolutionary political tactics in England, a major shift happens back home in Boston. Her wealthy grandmother passes away.
Oh. Which leaves Dix a sizable estate.
Yes, a very sizable estate. Combine that with the ongoing royalties from her massively successful books, and almost overnight she is guaranteed financial independence.
She never has to work for a paycheck again.
She is completely freed from the burden of daily survival.
So I'm really curious about the timeline here. She now has this independent wealth, and she's just been handed a blueprint for social reform from the British. When she gets back to America, does she just copy the British system? Like, how does she translate a British parliamentary lobbying tactic into American politics?
Well, she adapts the British model of investigation and data gathering for sure, but she applies it with this uniquely relentless American grit. And that brings us back to that freezing basement in East Cambridge in 1841.
Where we started.
Exactly. She's actually there to teach a Sunday school class to female prisoners, and that's when she stumbles upon those 4 mentally ill individuals freezing in the dark.
And, before Europe, she might have just been horrified and gone home. But after Europe, she knows exactly what to do with horror. She turns it into data.
She just launches this massive investigation. She discovers that the situation in East Cambridge isn't some tragic anomaly. It is standard operating procedure. Towns all across Massachusetts were simply contracting with locals to care for the mentally ill.
Farmed them out, basically.
Yeah, to these places often called almshouses, essentially local poorhouses that served as dumping grounds for anyone the community just didn't want to deal with. It was a completely unregulated system, and it resulted in widespread abuse.
And she documents every single horrific detail. In 1843, she publishes this fiery report, a memorial, and she takes it straight to the state legislature. And the quotes from this document, they are staggering.
They really are.
She says to the politicians, "I proceed, gentlemen, briefly to call your attention to the present state of insane persons confined within this Commonwealth, in cages, stalls, pens, chained, naked, beaten with rods, and lashed into obedience."
I mean, it is an absolute gut punch to the political establishment, and it works. Her lobbying actually forces a bill to expand the state's mental hospital in Worcester, but Massachusetts is just the proving ground.
All right, she's just getting started.
Over the next 3 years, in the mid-1840s, she embarks on an almost unfathomable journey. The historical records track her traveling over 10,000 miles by stagecoach.
Wow.
She visits over 500 almshouses, 300 county jails, and 18 state penitentiaries.
Put yourself in a stagecoach in the 1840s for just like one day.
Mm.
The bone-rattling wooden wheels, the mud, the freezing rain, just the total isolation. Now imagine doing that for 3 years straight while battling chronic depression and fragile physical health.
She was just fueled by this absolute burning conviction. She goes from New Hampshire all the way down to Louisiana, documenting the exact same abuses, reporting them, and drafting legislation to build state hospitals.
See, I am stuck in the political math here, though. Because it's the 1840s, women cannot vote.
Right.
They're entirely shut out of public political life. And you have these male-dominated legislatures that secretly or even openly do not want to spend the massive amount of tax dollars required to build these facilities.
Of course not. Nobody wants to raise taxes.
Exactly. So if she can't vote and she can't threaten a politician at the ballot box, she technically has zero political leverage.
Yeah.
How is a woman single-handedly bending state legislatures to her will?
It comes down to a brilliant three-pronged strategy: overwhelming data, strategic emotional storytelling, and the careful deployment of male political allies.
Okay.
Take New Jersey in 1844, for example. She tours the entire state, prepares this massive report, and demands a state facility. And some politicians, like you said, they secretly try to kill the bill because of taxes.
So how does she outmaneuver them without holding any official power?
Well, she doesn't shout from the public square. She holds these private evening meetings at her own home to build a political coalition. And during these meetings, she uses hyper-specific humanizing cases.
Like what?
So she describes finding a man lying on a small bed in a basement room of a county almshouse, completely bereft of comforts. But she doesn't just call him a pauper. She reveals to the room that this specific man was formerly a highly respected state legislator and jurist.
No.
A man many of the politicians in that very room actually knew personally.
Oh, that is brilliant. She looks these powerful men in the eye and essentially says, "This is your former colleague rotting in a basement. The line between you and him is a lot thinner than you think."
Exactly. It made the abstract, easily ignorable concept of mental decline terrifyingly personal to the decision makers. And once she had them emotionally cornered, she used procedural leverage.
Ah, the male allies.
Right. She had Senator Joseph S. Dodd formally introduce her report to the Senate, knowing a respected man's voice would carry the procedural weight she needed on the floor. By March 1845, the bill for a state facility is passed.
And she is pushing for what was called moral treatment, right? This is the idea that patients needed modesty, chastity, and delicacy rather than, chains and rods.
She is systematically replacing a system of punishment with a system of care. Illinois, North Carolina, Pennsylvania. She is practically single-handedly forcing the infrastructure of American mental health into existence. But fighting state by state, legislature by legislature, it was brutally slow. Dix wanted a permanent national solution.
Which brings us to a massive escalation. She decides to go after the federal government.
She goes right to the top.
She pushes a piece of legislation called the Bill for the Benefit of the Indigent Insane.
No.
And the scale of this proposal is just staggering. She lobbies the federal government to set aside 12.2 million acres of federal land.
Unbelievable.
Right. The idea was that the proceeds from selling this massive land grant would be placed into a perpetual trust fund, distributed to the states, and used exclusively to build and maintain asylums.
It was an unprecedented vision for federal social welfare. Literally no one had ever proposed using national resources for vulnerable citizens on this kind of scale. And through her sheer, relentless lobbying, leveraging all the fame and the data she'd gathered from her state victories, she miraculously gets it passed through both houses of the United States Congress.
It's an incredible victory. But then heartbreak strikes. In 1854, President Franklin Pierce vetoes the bill.
Just a crushing blow.
He argues that social welfare is strictly the responsibility of the individual states, and that the federal government has no constitutional authority to become, in his words, the great almoner of public charity.
The veto is the absolute high watermark of her antebellum career, collapsing overnight. The entire national framework she envisioned just vanishes.
But if we've learned anything about Dorothea Dix, it's that idle defeat is not in her vocabulary. Stung by the veto, she immediately packs her bags and sails back to Europe in 1854.
She reconnects with the Rathbone family. And British politicians, who are well aware of her American reputation by now, they actually encourage her to investigate the madhouses in Scotland.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, she conducts her usual rigorous inspections, and her subsequent report directly leads to the formation of the Scottish Lunacy Commission. This was a monumental step, a dedicated government body tasked with the systematic oversight of mental health facilities.
And she doesn't even stop in Scotland. She travels to the Channel Islands, crosses Europe, and eventually she ends up in Rome. And she discovers the asylums there are in terrible disrepair.
Right.
But instead of talking to local officials, she decides she needs to speak to the person at the very top. She seeks an audience with Pope Pius IX.
Think about the pure audacity required to demand a meeting with the Pope to criticize his city's hospitals.
I know, but the incredible part is that the Pope listens to her.
Mm.
Her data is so undeniable that he investigates the asylums himself.
He actually goes and looks.
He does, and he's shocked by the conditions he finds.
Yeah.
In a second audience, he actually thanks her. He points out the profound historical irony that a woman and a Protestant had crossed the seas to call his attention to these cruelly ill-treated members of his flock.
It is just a testament to the undeniable moral authority she had built. When she spoke about the suffering of the mentally ill, even the Pope had to bend to the facts.
And her drive to investigate and fix things was almost compulsive at this point. The sources detail this wild side quest where she visits Nova Scotia in 1853.
Oh, the Sable Island story.
Yes, she travels out to Sable Island because of these grim rumors about mentally ill patients being abandoned there. She investigates, finds the rumors are completely unfounded, but while she's on the island, she witnesses a horrific shipwreck.
Right.
So she immediately goes back to Boston, runs a successful campaign to send upgraded life-saving equipment to Sable Island. And the very day after her supplies arrive, another ship wrecks. Her equipment literally saves 180 people.
It perfectly highlights her core impulse. To save, to structure, to fix whatever broken system was placed in front of her. I mean, she ultimately founded 32 hospitals and even influenced the creation of 2 in Japan.
That's a massive legacy.
It is. But if we connect all these individual victories, a glaring pattern emerges. Her unyielding, forceful personality worked absolute wonders when she was fighting as a lone crusader against a sluggish system.
Right.
But that exact same personality would become her greatest liability when she was forced to work inside a team during a massive national crisis.
Yeah. If her superpower was fighting as a lone wolf against the establishment, what happens when the government actually puts her in charge of the establishment? The Civil War breaks out in 1861, and things get very complicated.
Very. As the war turns incredibly bloody, the Secretary of War, Simon Cameron, who had long admired her advocacy, appoints her as the Superintendent of Army Nurses for the Union Army.
Which, on paper, handing a logistical genius the reins to the medical corps sounds like a perfect fit.
It sounds great.
But the reality was a disaster. First of all, she wasn't a trained medical nurse herself. Yet she immediately implements these incredibly rigid, almost bizarrely strict rules for her nurse volunteers.
Oh, the rules were intense.
They had to be between 35 and 50 years old. They had to be, in her exact words, plain looking. And they were strictly forbidden from wearing any jewelry or cosmetics.
She demanded absolute discipline and zero distraction in the wards. And in enforcing that vision, she alienated almost everyone around her. She constantly feuded with the military doctors, many of whom were, honestly, deeply prejudiced and didn't want female nurses on the battlefield to begin with.
Right, they already didn't want her there.
Exactly. And she demanded absolute control over hospital policy and just refused to delegate.
It's like a startup founder.
Yeah.
She built this incredible product from scratch in a garage by controlling every single detail. But when the company goes public and faces a massive crisis, she completely lacks the collaborative skills to manage a board of directors. She's treating adult volunteer war nurses with the same rigid control she used to define her dictionary of flowers.
That is a perfect analogy. And that rigidity had a much darker side, too. The Union Army had over 600 Catholic sisters successfully serving as nurses, providing desperately needed care.
Okay.
But Dix fiercely distrusted them. Her deep-seated anti-Catholicism completely undermined her ability to coordinate with them. Her prejudices really blinded her to the very real life-saving help they were providing. And we have to impartially report what the sources say here, which is that she held some intense biases.
Yeah, the sources are clear on that. And her political views during the war were just as rigid. Before the conflict, she had traveled the South extensively to build asylums and was really well received by politicians down there. But once the war started, she developed an intense personal hatred for the Confederacy.
She really did.
She publicly denounced civilian supporters of the South as having been transformed to demons. She even wrote a letter to a friend saying, "God forgive those savage wretches in the South. I cannot."
Yet we find a fascinating paradox in the records.
Yeah.
Despite that intense, venomous personal hatred for the South, she instituted a strict, unbreakable policy in her hospitals. Confederate and Union wounded must be treated exactly alike.
That is incredible. It really shows that her sense of professional duty, her sheer commitment to medical order, was actually stronger than her personal hatred.
It was, but ultimately she simply made too many enemies. Organizations like the Women's Central Association of Relief and the United States Sanitary Commission emerged, and they were far more efficient, far more modern, and far more collaborative.
They were just better suited for it.
Yeah. By 1863, the Army bypassed her entirely, giving doctors full control over the nurses and essentially stripping Dix of her remaining power. She was eclipsed by more adaptable figures like Claire Barton. Dix eventually resigned in August 1865, viewing her own wartime service as a complete failure.
So the war ends, she is stripped of her national authority, and her reputation has taken a real hit. Where does she go?
She retreats to the one place she still has absolute control. She returns to the asylum system she built. She actually spends her post-war years touring the devastated South to evaluate war damage to the facilities she championed, raising funds for monuments, and just continuing her advocacy for the vulnerable.
Which brings us to her twilight years. In 1881, her health is failing rapidly, and she moves into a private suite in the New Jersey State Hospital in Trenton. The irony here is so thick. This is the very hospital she fought so hard to build, decades prior, using the story of the pauper jurist. The state legislature specifically designated the suite for her private use, and she lived out her final days there, writing letters to reformers in England and Japan until she died in 1887.
It's a really poignant ending to a restless life. As we evaluate her legacy today, it is vital that we look at her clearly without just mythologizing her achievements. We really have to acknowledge her massive blind spots.
Absolutely.
The sources reveal she held a deeply biased view that mental illness was a condition that primarily afflicted, in quotes, educated whites, largely ignoring the mental health needs of minorities. Again, just looking impartially at the sources, her views were very flawed there.
Her worldview was undeniably flawed, deeply prejudiced in certain areas, and wildly, aggressively stubborn.
Yep.
Yet the physical results of her crusade are undeniable. She founded dozens of hospitals. She inspired the architecture of the Kirkbride Plan, which was essentially this revolutionary blueprint that designed hospitals to have sprawling, sunlit wings to promote psychological healing rather than designing them to look like dark dungeons.
A huge shift.
She fundamentally shifted how humanity views and treats mental health. They even named a crater on Venus after her.
Her story really reminds us that historical progress is rarely clean. It's often pushed forward by complicated, difficult, and sometimes deeply prejudiced individuals who nevertheless manage to move the needle of human suffering in the right direction. She was a force of nature who demanded that society look into the dark basements it would rather ignore.
She really was. She spent her entire life building physical institutions to house and protect the most vulnerable people in society. But in doing so, she also built bureaucratic walls and interpersonal barriers that eventually shut her out of the very movements she helped start.
It's a tragic irony, really.
It is. I want to leave you with a thought to mull over as we wrap up today's deep dive. If you were handed the power to change the world tomorrow, how would you ensure that your own rigid convictions didn't ultimately become your own cage?